Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving into the world of Mexican-American activism after 1945.
Oh, yeah, it's a fascinating period, really a turning point.
And we've got some great material to work with. That Mr. Hutchings History episode really got me thinking.
Yeah, he does a great job of highlighting the key figures and events. But like with any historical deep dive, we got to start with the foundation, right?
Yeah.
Can't build a house without one.
Exactly. So before we get to the post-war period, let's rewind a bit. The podcast mentioned the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, formed way back in 1929. They were all about assimilation, using education and the legal system to fight discrimination.
They were. It was a strategic choice.
Yeah.
At the time, they believed that integrating into mainstream American society was the most effective path to equality.
Interesting. So it was about proving their Americanness through things like education and being active citizens.
Exactly. Think of it as, like, look, we're just as American as anyone else, so treat us accordingly.
Oh.
And this approach, well, it played out in a number of ways. Like you had the Delgado v. Bastrop independent school district case in 1948.
Wait, 1948, that's what, years before Brown v. Board of Education?
Yeah, it was a landmark case where LULAC challenged segregated schools for Mexican-American kids down in Texas, a real precursor to Brown, often overlooked.
Wow, I didn't realize that. So even before the civil rights movement gained steam, Mexican Americans were already fighting segregation. That really adds a whole new layer, doesn't it?
It does. It shows that this activism wasn't just a post-war phenomenon. It had roots going way back.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of activism, this focus on assimilation, but then, boom, World War II happens. And the podcast suggests this was a major turning point. What shifted after the war?
Well, World War II, it created this really complex situation. Think about it. Thousands of Mexican Americans served their country, fought for freedom overseas.
Came home as heroes, you'd think.
You'd think, right. But they came home too. Well, the same old discrimination. Can you imagine? Risking your life for your country and then being denied basic rights because of your heritage.
It's heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time.
Absolutely. And for a lot of people, it really shattered that illusion that simply proving their Americanness was enough. It was like, we did our part, where's our equality?
Right, like a promise broken.
Yeah. And you combine that disillusionment with the growing Mexican-American population, increased political awareness, it was a recipe for change. Like, things were bound to boil over.
And they did, right? I mean, you had those Zoot Suit Riots in Los Angeles back in '43. That was more than just a fashion statement, wasn't it?
Oh, way more. Those Zoot Suits with
Right.
the wide-legged pants and long jackets. For young Mexican-Americans, it was about rebellion, expressing their unique identity.
A way to stand out, make a statement.
Exactly. But for some Anglo-Americans, well, they saw it as unpatriotic, especially during wartime. And this culture clash, it just exploded when white servicemen started attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit.
It's hard to believe that something as simple as clothing could trigger such violence, but it speaks volumes about the racial tension simmering beneath the surface, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Those riots, they exposed the deep-seated prejudice and resentment that a lot of Mexican Americans faced, regardless of how hard they tried to fit in.
It's a stark reminder that assimilation alone doesn't guarantee equality.
It doesn't. It was a wake-up call, really, for a lot of people.
And then there's the Bracero Program, bringing Mexican laborers to the U.S. during the war. I can't help but think that added another layer of complexity to the whole situation.
It did. On the surface, the program was about addressing labor shortages, right?
Giving those gaps in the workforce.
Right. But it created a whole new set of issues. Yeah, it provided work opportunities for Mexicans, but the conditions were often exploitative. And, it fueled a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment among those who saw braceros as competition for American jobs.
So even with good intentions, sometimes those programs have unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting, even LULAC opposed the Bracero program.
Really? Why would they oppose something seemingly beneficial to Mexican workers?
Well, they were worried about the long-term impact. This influx of laborers, many with limited education, they feared it would reinforce negative stereotypes, and ultimately undermine their assimilation efforts.
So even within the Mexican-American community, there were disagreements on the best path forward.
There were. And this internal debate, this tension, well, it's crucial to understanding the different approaches that emerged in the activism of this period. And this is where someone like Felix Tijerina comes in.
Ah, Felix Tijerina. Now, this is where things get really interesting. The podcast mentioned his connection to Tex-Mex cuisine.
Yes. Tijerina was a prominent LULAC leader who really embodied that assimilationist vision. And he believed that food, well, it could be a bridge between cultures.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He thought that adapting Mexican dishes to American tastes, making them more palatable, could make Mexican culture more acceptable overall.
So, like, chili con carne and nachos, those were part of a strategy for social change.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how even something seemingly ordinary like food can be intertwined with complex social and political movements.
Food for thought, quite literally.
Right. But Tijerina's efforts, they weren't limited to the culinary world. He was a big champion of LULA's Little School of the 400 program.
What was that about?
Well, it focused on teaching young Mexican-American children 400 essential English words before they even started public school.
Oh, I see. Give them a head start, set them up for success.
Exactly. And that program, it really highlights LULA's belief in education as like the key to upward mobility and ultimately assimilation. Fluent English equals a better chance at succeeding in American society.
It makes sense given their overall goals. But things were shifting, right? After 1945, the podcast really emphasized this acceleration of activism. What drove that shift?
Well, the war was definitely a catalyst. But there's more to it. You have a whole generation of Mexican-American veterans coming home, more politically aware and ready to fight for their rights.
Battle-tested and ready for a different kind of fight.
Right. And then you have legal victories like Hernandez v. Texas Correa, which expanded civil rights protections for Mexican Americans, and of course the rise of the Chicano Movement in the 1960s, a new generation with a whole new approach.
That's what I'm really curious about. The Chicano movement feels like a departure from the assimilationist approach.
It was. They embraced cultural pride and rejected the idea that they needed to conform to Anglo-American norms.
So instead of blending in, it was more about, this is who we are and we demand respect.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective is key to understanding the evolving landscape of Mexican-American activism after World War II. We've got this mix of approaches, all aiming for equality, but with different ideas on how to get there.
It's a complex and dynamic movement for sure, and to truly understand it, I think we need to explore how historians have interpreted this period. They provide valuable lenses, right? Like different perspectives on this history.
Yeah. Like imagine looking at a painting through different colored glasses. Each lens highlights something different, adds another layer of meaning.
That's a great analogy. So let's dive into those different lenses and see what they reveal about this fascinating period in Mexican-American history.
So first up, we've got the progressive school with scholars like Carrie McWilliams.
McWilliams, a classic.
They focus on the economic exploitation of Mexican labor and how, deeply ingrained racism fueled so much of this activism.
So they're looking at the big picture, the systems that were stacked against Mexican Americans and pushed them to fight for change.
Exactly. They saw activism as a direct response to these inequalities. It was about pushing back against injustice, demanding a fair shake.
Makes sense. So what about the other schools of thought?
Well, you've got the social history school. Think Vicky Ruiz. They really highlight the grassroots efforts, the everyday people making change happen. And they emphasize the crucial role women played.
Oh, absolutely. Women are so often the unsung heroes, the backbone of these movements.
So true. And Ruiz's work shines a light on some incredible women, like Dolores Huerta, who co-founded the United Farm Workers, dedicated her life to advocating for the rights of those laborers. But then you've got the revisionist school, guys like Jorge Mariscal. They take a more critical look at that assimilationist approach.
Oh, interesting. What are their main criticisms?
Well, they argue that while striving for inclusion is great, right, sometimes assimilation can lead to a sort of cultural erasure.
Yeah.
Like, do you have to sacrifice too much of your own identity to fit in?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Is it possible to achieve true equality without losing yourself in the process?
It's a tough question, one that we're still grappling with today. And then there's the post-colonial school. Scholars like Juan Gonzales, they explore how U.S. imperialism and migration policies directly impacted Mexican-American identity and activism.
So it's not just about what was happening within the U.S., but also those larger global forces shaping their lives.
Exactly. They connect these struggles for civil rights to that bigger context of migration, displacement, the whole legacy of colonialism. It adds another dimension.
Wow, it's amazing how many layers there are to this story. It's a reminder that history is never simple, right?
Never. Always multiple perspectives, different ways of interpreting events. And to really grasp those nuances, we need to dig into primary sources. The podcast highlighted a few that are really insightful.
Ooh, I love a good primary source. What did they find?
Well, there's this 1926 New York Times editorial. Pretty shocking, even by today's standards.
Oh no, what did it say?
It uses this incredibly racist language to describe Mexican Americans, drawing these stark lines between older stock citizens and transient laborers, the other.
It's crazy how easily they dehumanize a whole group of people with just a few words.
It is. And those words, they have real-world consequences. They shape public opinion, influence policy decisions.
Right. Words have power.
Think about the Bracero Program or Operation Wetback, that mass deportation program back in the 50s. Those policies weren't just random events. They were fueled by those underlying prejudices and stereotypes.
A stark reminder of how words can be used to justify discrimination.
Absolutely. But the podcast also highlighted some primary sources that show those different approaches within the Mexican-American community, too.
Oh, right. The internal debates we talked about earlier.
Like, remember Felix Tijerina? His culinary diplomacy, adapting Mexican dishes to appeal to American palates. And LULAC's Little School of the 400? Those were prime examples of the assimilationist approach in action.
Trying to create those bridges, find common ground.
Yeah. They genuinely believed that education and cultural adaptation were pathways to acceptance. But then you have the voices of the Chicano movement. A very different story.
Yeah, a more defiant stance, embracing their heritage, demanding respect on their own terms.
Right. Leaders like Rodolfo Gonzales, their speeches and writings are powerful, real expressions of cultural pride. They rejected that pressure to conform. They were like, true equality means being accepted for who we are, not who society wants us to be.
So you have this clash of ideologies, right? The idea that blending in leads to success versus the idea that true equality means embracing your unique identity. That's a tension that resonates even today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a conversation that continues in so many different communities. It's about finding that balance, holding on to your heritage while also navigating a society that doesn't always make space for difference.
It's complex. But this deep dive, it's really opened my eyes to the nuances of this history. It's not just a straight line, a simple narrative of progress or struggle. It's so much more than that.
It is. And it's important to remember that this isn't just ancient history. The echoes of these struggles, they're still present today. They shape how we think about identity, social justice, the very meaning of equality.
Okay, so we've explored the historical context, those different schools of thought, even dived into primary sources. But what does this all mean for us now? What can we learn from this history? How do we apply those lessons to the challenges we face today?
That's the big question, right? And I think the legacy of Mexican-American activism after 1945 offers some pretty profound insights. First and foremost, it highlights the power of collective action.
People power.
Exactly. Whether it's legal battles, grassroots organizing, even something like culinary diplomacy, people coming together to fight for a common cause, it can make a real difference.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in our struggles. There's strength in numbers.
Absolutely. And second, this history really underscores the importance of understanding and challenging systemic inequalities, those deep-rooted structures that perpetuate injustice.
Right. We talked about how racism and discrimination were baked into laws, policies, even language.
And those systems, they don't just disappear overnight. It takes sustained effort, generation after generation, to dismantle them and create a truly just society.
It's not enough to just call out individual acts of prejudice. We have to tackle the root causes.
And finally, I think this history reminds us that identity is complex and multifaceted. We saw how Mexican Americans grappled with questions of assimilation versus cultural pride. That tension is still so relevant today.
It is. It's about finding your place in the world, defining yourself on your own terms.
And that's a powerful message, especially in a world that often tries to put people in boxes, divide us based on our differences. We can learn from those who came before us, from their struggles, and use those lessons to build a more inclusive future.
That's a great takeaway. We've covered so much ground today. Early activism, World War II, the Chicano Movement, different ways of looking at this history. It's been an incredible journey.
It has. And even though we just scratched the surface, we've uncovered some really valuable insights.
Absolutely. So as we wrap things up, what would you say is the most important lesson we can learn from this exploration of Mexican-American activism?
Well, for me, it's the sheer resilience of the Mexican-American community. Facing all that adversity, they never gave up the fight for equality. They never stopped believing in a better future.
It's inspiring. They had different approaches, different strategies, but that unwavering commitment to justice, that's what united them.
And that's what can unite us today, too. Remember, social change movements are rarely simple. There are always going to be debates, disagreements, different paths to the same goal. The key is to find common ground, work together toward that shared vision.
Beautiful. So any final thoughts for our listeners out there?
Keep exploring, keep learning. This deep dive is just the beginning. There's so much more to discover about Mexican-American activism. And as you learn, connect those historical struggles to the issues we face today. Ask yourself, how can I be a part of building a more just and equitable world?
Fantastic. And on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those conversations going and keep fighting for what's right.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How do we balance holding onto our heritage while navigating a world that isn't always so accepting of differences?
Right. It's tough. But hey, that's kind of the beauty of it all, right? This whole journey of figuring out who we are, where we belong.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive has given us a lot to chew on, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. From early activism, the war years, the rise of the Chicano movement, and all those different ways historians view this history, it's a lot.
It is. And even though it feels like we've just scratched the surface, I think we've uncovered some pretty important insights.
Definitely. So as we wrap things up here, what stands out to you as, like, the biggest takeaway from all this?
For me, it's the resilience of the Mexican-American community. All those challenges they faced, the discrimination, the setbacks, they just never gave up on the fight for equality. It's incredibly inspiring. I agree. And it wasn't just one group, one approach. You had LULAC, the Chicano Movement, all these different organizations with their own visions.
Right. But they were all united by this shared commitment to a better future.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful reminder for us today, you know. Social change movements, they're rarely neat and tidy. There's always going to be debate, different strategies, different paths to the same goal.
It's about finding that common ground, working together despite those differences.
Exactly. And never losing sight of that ultimate goal, justice and equality for all.
Well said. So any final thoughts for our listeners out there as we wrap up this deep dive into Mexican-American activism?
I'd say first and foremost, remember the power of collective action. Never underestimate what can be achieved when people come together, you know. Raise their voices, fight for what they believe in.
Right, there's strength in numbers. We can achieve so much more together than we ever could alone.
And second, I'd say keep learning, keep exploring. This is just the beginning of the journey. There are so many stories, so many perspectives to uncover. Dig into the source material we talked about today. Seek out other resources. Dive deeper into this history.
It's an ongoing process,
Yeah.
right? Always more to learn, more to understand.
Absolutely. And as you explore, think about how these historical struggles connect to the issues we face in the world today. What lessons can we apply to our own lives? How can we be more informed, more engaged citizens?
How can we continue that fight for justice and equality, building on the legacy of those who came before us?
Exactly. Those are the questions we should all be asking ourselves.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep those conversations going and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.